Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
I grew up in West Virginia and spent almost my entire life there. It wasn't until about 2 years ago that I finally left, and looking back, it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made. I hear people romanticize those mountains all the time. They talk about the breathtaking scenery, the endless forests, the quiet roads, and the sense of freedom you supposedly find out there. I understand why. They really are beautiful. There are mornings when the fog settles between the ridges, the trees stretch farther than you can see, and everything looks like something out of a painting. I don't think anyone could honestly deny how incredible that landscape is. But beauty and peace aren't always the same thing. As the years went by, I started feeling like those mountains were closing in around me. I lived in an incredibly isolated community, and although things have improved a lot compared to when I was growing up, the mindset in many places is still very old-fashioned. People tend to know everything about everyone else's lives. Outsiders aren't always welcomed, and it can sometimes feel like you're trapped in a place where nobody ever truly moves forward. Eventually, I realized I couldn't picture the rest of my life there. Over the years, I experienced more unsettling situations than I care to remember, which probably isn't surprising considering how remote some parts of Appalachia really are. Those mountains attract all kinds of people. Some come looking for peace and solitude. Others come because they know there are places where nobody asks questions. Then there are the people who have lived there their entire lives, who smile, wave, and act like the friendliest neighbors you've ever met, only for everyone to discover years later that they were hiding something unimaginably disturbing. I even ended up involved in a court case against the man who lived directly across the road from us, because he was the kind of person parents quietly kept their children away from. If you know what I mean, you probably don't need me to explain any further. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 8 years old. Back then, parents gave their kids far more freedom than they probably would today. In places like ours, where the nearest town was a long drive away and the forest surrounded everything, there wasn't much else for children to do besides disappear outside for the day. We practically grew up among the trees. From a very young age, we learned how to respect wildlife, keep our distance from black bears, leave snakes alone, recognize animal tracks, and avoid putting ourselves in dangerous situations. Looking back, it's almost funny that we were taught how to survive encounters with wild animals. Yet nobody ever spent much time explaining that the most dangerous thing we could run into out there wasn't an animal at all. It was another person. Our school was tiny. When I say tiny, I mean there were only about 13 students altogether, spread across different grades in the same building. We barely had enough kids to fill a classroom, and if I'm being completely honest, I don't think I received much of an education during those years. Most days felt more like babysitting than actual school. Since there wasn't much happening in our little community, we'd invent games and stupid competitions to entertain ourselves. Like kids everywhere, we were obsessed with proving who was brave and who was still just a little kid. If you backed out of a challenge, you could expect to hear about it for weeks. A few miles from where we lived stood an old abandoned house deep in the woods. Years before, 2 2 children had reportedly drowned in the small lake behind the property, and ever since then the place had developed a reputation throughout the area. People claimed it was haunted. Adults rarely talked about it, but kids never stopped. Every strange noise became part of the legend. Every shadow in the trees turned into another ghost story. Before long, walking up to that house had become the ultimate test of courage. Anyone willing to go there after dark had supposedly proven they were grown up. Anyone who refused was labeled a coward. Unfortunately for me, I lost one of those stupid bets. The punishment was simple. That night, after our parents had gone to bed, I had to follow the older boy I'd lost too, all the way out to the abandoned house. The rest of the group would wait outside while I went in completely alone. My job was to make it all the way upstairs, walk to the front window, wave so everyone could see me, and then come back out. Looking back now, I can't believe any of us thought this was a good idea, but when you're 8 years old, embarrassing yourself in front of your friends somehow feels scarier than walking into an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. The night we chose couldn't have been more memorable. There was a full moon overhead, bright enough that you could actually make out the outlines of the trees and the old dirt road leading to the property. Around there, nights are usually so dark that once the sun disappears, you can barely see your own hand in front of your face. That evening was different. The moonlight made everything strangely visible, which should have been comforting, but somehow it wasn't. If anything, it made the whole place feel even more unsettling. Every story we'd ever heard about full moons, ghosts, bad luck, and things hiding in the woods came flooding back into my mind. We were just children, and we'd spent years terrifying each other with stories exactly like those. By the time we reached the house, I was shaking so badly it felt less like fear and more like my entire body had forgotten how to stop trembling. When I finally stepped inside, my first thought wasn't about ghosts. It was that the floor was going to collapse beneath me. The old wooden boards had absorbed years of moisture, and every step made them bend just enough that I was convinced I was about to fall straight through into the basement. A few yards farther in, though, the floor suddenly became much sturdier. It almost looked as if someone had repaired sections of it long after the rest of the house had been abandoned, which struck me as odd even back then, although I was far too frightened to think much about it. I kept moving because all I wanted was to get it over with as quickly as possible. I climbed the staircase one careful step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing inside my own ears. At one point, I became so dizzy that I nearly lost my balance and tumbled back down the stairs. Somehow, I caught myself, took a deep breath, and forced myself to keep going until I reached the second floor. I walked over to the front window, exactly like we'd planned, and raised my hand. Outside, I could see the rest of the group gathered near the tree line, all staring up toward the house. One of them spotted me almost immediately and pointed excitedly in my direction. I started waving back. Then I noticed that he wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing at the man standing directly behind me. It all happened instantly. Everything seemed to unfold at exactly the same moment. The kids outside started screaming. I caught a reflection in the dusty window, and I realized there was someone standing only a few feet behind me. Every ounce of blood seemed to drain out of my body. I froze for what couldn't have been more than a fraction of a second before turning around, and I came face to face with a man whose appearance has never left my memory. He had an enormous beard that covered most of his face, and in one of his hands he was holding what looked unmistakably like a gun. The moment our eyes met, every instinct inside me completely shut down. I don't think words can properly describe the level of panic I felt. My chest tightened so violently that I honestly thought I was about to pass out right there. Time almost stopped. I remember seeing his arm beginning to move, realizing he was raising the weapon, and understanding that if I hesitated for even another second, I might never make it out of that house. I never made a conscious decision. My body reacted before my mind had any chance to catch up. Right beside me, leaning against an old cabinet, was some kind of heavy object. To this day, I couldn't tell you what it actually was because I never stopped long enough to look. I grabbed it with both hands and threw it as hard as I possibly could. By what can only be described as pure luck, it struck him directly in the head. He stumbled just enough for me to squeeze past him before he could recover. I ducked underneath his arm, nearly tripped over my own feet, and practically threw myself down the staircase. I don't remember touching half the steps. I was sliding, jumping, grabbing the railing, doing anything I could to get outside. The second I reached the front door, I burst through it without even looking back. By then, every other kid had already disappeared. The group that had been waiting outside had scattered the moment they realized there was someone else inside the house, and I suddenly found myself completely alone. I ran harder than I had ever run in my entire life. My house wasn't terribly far away, maybe 10 minutes if you walked, but I covered that distance faster than I ever thought was physically possible. The entire time, I was convinced he was chasing me. Every snapping branch behind me sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like someone closing the distance. Looking back now, he probably wasn't following me at all, but fear has a way of inventing things your brain can't separate from reality. I didn't dare turn around even once. I just kept running until I saw the lights from our house shining through the trees. The second I got close enough to see the porch, I started screaming. I didn't care how loud I sounded or whether I woke the entire neighborhood. My parents came rushing outside almost immediately, and I can still remember the expressions on their faces. They looked just as terrified as I was, trying to figure out why I was crying so hard that I could barely breathe. Between gasps, I told them everything. I expected them to yell at me. I expected to be grounded for sneaking out in the middle of the night. Instead, they wrapped me in blankets, sat me down, and listened from beginning to end without interrupting. When I finally finished, they told me they were just thankful I had made it home alive. They said they hoped I understood now that the woods weren't a playground and that stupid dares weren't worth risking my life over. Looking back, that was probably the only positive thing that came out of the entire experience. At a time when plenty of parents would have punished their kids first and asked questions later, mine recognized that I was completely traumatized. They chose compassion over anger, and I've never forgotten that. The following morning, my dad contacted the sheriff's office, and deputies went out to inspect the property. They searched the house from top to bottom and found nothing that suggested anyone had been living there. No sleeping bag, no food, no clothing, no campfire, nothing. It was as if the man had simply vanished. Because everything had happened so quickly, I couldn't even give them a useful description. I knew he was white. I knew he had an unusually long beard, and I knew he'd been holding what looked like a firearm. Beyond that, my memory was almost blank. Terror has a strange way of erasing details you wish you'd remembered. Even now, decades later, this remains one of those memories that can still trigger an almost physical reaction. Every time I think about turning around and seeing that man standing only a few feet behind me, my stomach knots up, my pulse jumps, and for a split second, it feels like I'm back inside that house all over again. Maybe that feeling will fade someday. I honestly don't know if it ever will. What I do know is that I still don't like being alone at night. I avoid walking through isolated areas after dark whenever I can, and nothing on earth could ever convince me to step inside another abandoned house. Some fears stay with you because they're irrational. Others stay because, once upon a time, they were completely real. Everything I'm about to tell you happened earlier this year. And even now, neither my wife nor I have been able to come up with an explanation that makes any sense. I know people are going to suggest we imagined it, that we were exhausted, that we accidentally ate something bad, or that it was some kind of hallucination caused by being deep in the wilderness. I can tell you right now that none of that happened. We hadn't eaten anything spoiled. We hadn't taken anything that could have altered our minds, and we were both completely clear-headed. More importantly, we both experienced the exact same thing. We both heard it. We both saw it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't sleep paralysis, and it wasn't one person influencing the other afterward. Something happened out there, and whatever it was has stayed with both of us ever since. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened because if someone out there has an explanation that actually fits what we experienced, I'd genuinely like to hear it. I already posted this story on an online forum a while back, and people came up with all kinds of theories. Some were interesting, some were completely out there, but none of them felt remotely close to what we witnessed. Even so, I appreciate everyone who tried, because at this point, I almost feel like I need to organize this memory inside my own head. I need to put a name to it, or at least convince myself that what happened has some kind of explanation. My wife and I had planned an 8-day hiking trip through the Appalachians, something that wasn't unusual for us at all. We spend a lot of time outdoors, although we usually hike sections of the Pacific Crest Trail or explore areas farther south. This time we decided it was finally time to come back to the Appalachian Mountains. The funny thing is, we'd actually been there once before, about 10 years earlier, right after we got married. It had been one of the places we visited during our honeymoon. I know that probably sounds strange to a lot of people. Most couples picture beaches, luxury hotels, or cruises when they think about a honeymoon. We packed backpacks, climbing gear, a tent, and spent weeks hiking through different mountain ranges instead. That's always been who we are. We both love climbing, backpacking, camping, and disappearing into nature whenever life allows it. The Appalachians ended up becoming one of our favorite memories from that trip because the scenery was honestly breathtaking. It's one of those places that somehow manages to make you feel incredibly small while reminding you how unbelievably beautiful the world can be. We talked for years about going back, but life kept getting in the way, and this year we finally made it happen. It's strange how one experience can completely change the way you remember a place. Every time I think about those mountains now, I don't just remember our honeymoon anymore. I remember what happened this year, and I honestly don't know if I'll ever be able to separate the two memories again. Our route was supposed to take us through several waterfalls that used to be connected by an old hiking trail. The trail itself had been closed years ago after multiple drowning accidents. 2 people had disappeared there without ever being found, one of them a child, and eventually the authorities decided it wasn't safe enough to keep the route open. That didn't really discourage us because we'd spent years hiking through places where there weren't any marked trails at all. We were comfortable navigating with maps, GPS equipment, compasses, and experience. We knew how to travel through terrain that most people avoided. The first 3 days were everything we'd hoped they would be. The weather was perfect, the forest seemed endless, and every overlook somehow looked even better than the last one. The mountains were exactly as we'd remembered them. Beautiful, peaceful, and almost impossibly wild. Of course, we respected the place. Anyone who spent enough time out there knows how quickly those mountains can humble you. A wrong turn, a steep slope, or a swollen creek can become dangerous faster than people realize. Still, those first few days couldn't have gone better. Everything changed on the 4th night. By then, we'd wandered far enough off the established routes that there weren't any maintained trails nearby anymore. We'd intentionally chosen a more remote section because that's usually where we enjoy ourselves the most. It was probably around 11 at night. My wife was already inside the tent, reading while I stayed outside a little longer, cleaning up after dinner and making sure we hadn't left anything behind that might attract wildlife. That's when I heard it. At first, I couldn't even process what I was listening to. Before I could say anything, my wife burst out of the tent, looking completely panicked, and immediately asked if I could hear it too. I didn't even have to answer, because it was impossible to miss. Somewhere deep in the forest, a woman was screaming. Except, screaming somehow isn't the right word. It sounded like pure agony. There was something almost unreal about it at the same time. The closest comparison I can think of is the way sirens are portrayed in old operas or ancient stories. There was something hauntingly beautiful hidden inside that sound. Something that pulled at you emotionally while simultaneously filling you with absolute dread. It was heartbreaking. That's honestly the only way I know how to describe it. Listening to her made me feel like crying myself. There was so much pain in those cries that it almost felt physically impossible not to react. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that whatever was happening, somebody might actually need help. We were experienced hikers. We carried enough equipment to protect ourselves if something went wrong, and neither of us thought we could simply ignore someone who sounded like they were suffering that much. So we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the cries. The problem was that it was already completely dark. Even with good lights, navigating unfamiliar terrain at night is nothing like hiking during the day. Within 5 minutes, we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. We were completely disoriented. The woman's cries seemed to bounce through the forest in ways that made absolutely no sense. 1 second it sounded like she was directly ahead of us, then it shifted behind us, then somewhere off to the left, until eventually it felt as though it was coming from every direction at once. Then it stopped. Just stopped. We immediately tried retracing our steps to get back to our campsite, but neither of us could figure out where we'd come from. We kept walking in circles through the trees, trying to recognize landmarks that all looked identical in the darkness. At one point, I grabbed my wife's arm and realized she was freezing cold. Not because of the temperature, but because she was absolutely terrified. Getting lost in the Appalachian wilderness at night is already bad enough. Getting lost while following screams you can't explain is something else entirely. Eventually, we decided we had to stop moving for a few minutes and calm ourselves down. We figured we'd have a better chance of finding our bearings if we stayed still instead of blindly wandering deeper into the forest. The moment we stopped, the crying started again. This time there was one major difference. We could both clearly tell where it was coming from. It was somewhere off to our right. We looked at each other without saying much. We were frightened, exhausted, completely lost, and yet neither of us could shake the feeling that someone desperately needed help. Against every ounce of common sense we had, we started walking toward the sound again. After several minutes, something slowly appeared between the trees. It was a house. Even from a distance, under nothing more than moonlight, it was obvious the place had been abandoned for years. Parts of the roof had collapsed, windows were broken, and the entire structure looked like the forest had been trying to swallow it for decades. Our first thought was that maybe someone had taken shelter inside after getting injured or while trying to escape an animal. Nothing else made sense. As we got closer, we finally saw her. She was standing upstairs, framed by one of the broken windows, looking upward into the night, while crying with exactly the same heartbreaking sound we'd been following through the woods. There was no question that she was the source of it. Then, without warning, she looked directly at us. The crying stopped instantly. Complete silence filled the forest. She stared at both of us for a second that somehow felt much longer than it actually was. And then she smiled. I've spent weeks trying to explain that smile, and I can't. It wasn't exaggerated or unnatural. It wasn't impossibly wide like something from a horror movie. It was simply a smile that every instinct inside my body immediately recognized as dangerous. I don't know how else to describe it. Sometimes your brain understands something before your conscious mind does. Every survival instinct I have screamed that we needed to leave immediately. My wife grabbed my arm at the exact same moment I reached for hers, and without either of us saying a single word, we both turned and ran. I stumbled almost immediately and hit the ground hard. My wife stopped without hesitating, pulled me back onto my feet, and we just kept running. Neither of us had any idea where we were going anymore. We only knew we needed as much distance as possible between ourselves and that house. Behind us, the crying started again. It sounded exactly the same as before, except now it seemed impossible to locate. It echoed through the trees until it almost felt like it wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It felt like it was inside our own heads. We never looked back. We spent the entire night stumbling through the mountains, walking until daylight finally gave us enough visibility to orient ourselves again. We never found our campsite. We never found our backpacks, our tent, or any of our gear. By that point, neither of us cared. We didn't want our equipment anymore. We just wanted to get out of those mountains. Eventually, we reached a small, nearby community, explained that we'd gotten lost, arranged transportation back to where we'd left our car, and drove home without ever returning for anything we'd left behind. I haven't been back to that part of the Appalachian since, and I never will. I don't know what we saw standing in that upstairs window. I don't know who she was, why her cries seemed to move through the forest the way they did, or why that smile terrified both of us so completely. All I know is that weeks have passed, and neither my wife nor I have been able to get those screams out of our heads. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is completely quiet, I still catch myself thinking I can hear them somewhere in the distance. It's almost
Story 1. The Glitch in the Nightlight. Elias's life before the new apartment had been a comfortable slide into digital complacency. He was a software architect, a man who believed in code, logic, and the absolute predictability of the digital world. His 4-year-old daughter, Chloe, was the only beautiful chaos in his meticulously planned routine. The new apartment was in a restored 1920s building in a historically affluent part of the city. He'd ignored the eccentric building managers rambling about previous tenants and low-frequency hums. The only thing that truly bothered him was the cold, which Chloe, with her unsettling childhood instinct, called the static man. Chloe had a simple, dome-shaped nightlight that projected a beautiful, slow-moving galaxy of blue and green stars onto her ceiling. It was her sentinel against the dark. The routine disaster began at 1:45 a.m. Elias was already awake, reviewing code for a high-priority bug, when he heard Chloe whimper. He went to her room. She wasn't crying. She was simply pointing at the ceiling, her face pale in the faint, swirling starlight. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice too flat for a 4-year-old. "Stars are sticking. He's taking the pictures." He looked up. The galaxy was beautiful and smooth. "No, sweetie, they're fine. Just go back to sleep." He tucked her in, but a creeping discomfort stayed with him. He retreated, but didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the rain outside and the silence inside. At 3 a.m., the silence broke. It was a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from Chloe's room, a dry, rhythmic, metallic click, shh, like an old slide carousel advancing. Elias walked slowly to her door, pushing it open an inch. The star-field light was on, but it was behaving erratically. The blue and green stars weren't glitching yet, they were stuttering. The cool, hypnotic movement was punctuated by sudden, violent jumps, like a record needle skidding across vinyl. He squinted, trying to rationalize it. Faulty motor, cheap wiring. But the click was relentless, and with every jump in the star field, the light on the ceiling momentarily seemed to warp, as if the atmosphere in the room was being violently displaced. He finally stepped inside the room. Chloe was asleep, facing the wall. He looked up. The stars were now definitely skipping frames, and in the millisecond of pitch blackness between the frames, his eyes, straining in the dark, caught a glimpse of something. It was an absence, a space that was too dark to be natural. He watched one full cycle. The light was on for 3 seconds,
then a flash of blackness, then the light resumed slightly ahead of where it should have been. Click, shink. During the next flash, he saw the edge of a shape, not a shadow, because shadows are the absence of light cast by an object. This was an object that consumed light, a vertical pillar of absolute, perfect zero. Click, shink. The black shape was standing in the corner, tall and pencil-thin. Click, shink. The shape had stretched, its proportions becoming unnaturally long. It was now a terrifying, emaciated silhouette. Click, shink. Now the shape was moving. Its position had shifted to the foot of Chloe's bed. It moved only in the fractions of a second when the nightlight failed, covering impossible distances in absolute darkness. Elias's logical mind had failed. He was viewing a phenomenon that defied physics, a glitch in reality tethered to a $4 plastic lamp. He was trembling, his hand reaching for Chloe, but his feet were cemented to the floor by an ancient, instinctual terror. He felt if he broke the click-shink rhythm, the creature would be released from its temporal cage. At 3:17 a.m., the sounds changed. The click-shink became a slow, deliberate thump, 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 the rhythm of a heartbeat or heavy, slow footfalls. Thump, thump, thump. The star field dissolved entirely. Now the light was simply flashing, blue, black, blue, black. During the black, the figure was now at the head of the bed, leaning over Chloe. Its face, if it had one, was pressed against the invisible boundary of the light. Thump, thump, thump. Elias saw the hand, not spindly, but massive, heavy, and disproportionate, slowly reaching down. He finally broke. He roared, a guttural sound of pure panic, and lunged forward. The nightlight gave one final violent thump and then went solid blue. The light was clear. The room was bathed in a gentle, unwavering glow. The figure was gone. Elias clutched Chloe, burying his face in her hair. He stirred, but didn't wake. He looked at the nightlight, the small plastic globe now steady, projecting a beautiful, unmoving universe. Then, from the plastic grate of the nightlight's speaker, a noise, low and distorted like a corrupted MP3 file, a whisper. Elias, she told me you like to watch. Elias. The voice was not Chloe's. It was deep and dry, but it knew his name. And then he felt a faint pressure on his ankle, an impossibly cold touch. He looked down. No one was there. But as he stared at the nightlight, he saw it. Projected perfectly into the center of the blue galaxy, replacing the largest star, was a single black, motionless eye. It was watching him. The thump, thump, thump began again, not from the light, but from somewhere inside the floorboards, beneath his feet, ready for the next blackout.
Story 2. The Soundproof Silence. Arthur Pendleton didn't just dislike noise, he feared it. An early career in a deafening factory had left him with permanent, nerve-shredding tinnitus.
Now a retired watchmaker, he'd poured his life savings into building the perfect quiet space, his basement workshop. It was a bunker lined with a caustic foam, reinforced concrete, and sealed by a custom triple-latch soundproof door. A door so effective that standing outside it was like standing on the edge of a sensory deprivation tank. Tonight, at 1:30 a.m., Arthur was in his element, surrounded by the beautiful, delicate ticking of dozens of restored clocks. He was deep in the heart of a difficult piece, a 19th century French regulator. He inhaled, tasting the metallic dust and the faint scent of oil. The air was still. It was perfect. And then he felt it. It was a slight pressure drop, a fleeting moment where the air felt thinner, followed by a heavy, almost sticky quality. He paused, holding a pair of tweezers over a tiny gear. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud. It was low, almost below the threshold of human hearing, yet physically felt. A bass resonance that bypassed the ears and vibrated the bone structure in his skull. It was a whoom. Arthur's tinnitus was already a constant high-pitched whine. This new deep sound felt like two different realities trying to occupy the same space. He stood up, walking around the workshop, his feet sinking slightly into the foam floor. The whoom intensified, creating a distinct, sickening vibration in the floor itself. It felt like the entire house was sinking into wet clay. He reached the soundproof door and checked the 3 massive latches, all locked. The door was doing its job. The sound was not coming in. It was generating inside. At 2:05 a.m., the womb was so powerful that the tools on his workbench began to dance. A tiny spring oscillated until it flew off the bench. He had built a room to contain silence, and now that silence was being violently expelled. He realized the hum was alive. It was rhythmical, but irregular, like the deep, labored breathing of something unimaginably vast. He backed away from the workbench, his eyes scanning the room. The air was now shimmering. A heat haze, but cold. A visible distortion that began to pool in the corner farthest from the door. He looked for a source, a crack in the foundation, a failing appliance. Nothing. The sound was everywhere. As he watched, the shimmering distortion began to coalesce. It didn't take a shape that resembled anything living. It was a black, oily sphere that seemed to absorb all light and shadow. It pulsed slowly with the deep whoom. He instinctively knew what it was. A pocket of pure sonic null. It was the true sound of nothing. And it had been drawn to the only perfect silence in the city, Arthur's soundproof room. At 2:44 a.m., the sphere began to expand, slowly filling the center of the workshop. Arthur pressed himself against the soundproof door, trying to make himself small. As the sphere filled the space, the delicate, constant sound of the clocks began to fail. Not suddenly, but one by one, their ticks became duller, flatter, and then simply ceased. The gears were still moving, the pendulum swinging, but the sound was gone, eaten by the void. When the last grandfather clock went silent, the sphere stopped growing. It settled into the center of the room, now shaped less like a sphere and more like a massive, shapeless black lung. And then it inhaled. It wasn't a physical suction. It was a cosmic draw. The womb cut out instantly, replaced by an absolute, perfect zero of sound. The silence was so profound that Arthur felt the pressure change painfully inside his skull. His eardrums registered only a deep, agonizing vacuum. He saw the thing in the middle of the room. It was not moving, but it was listening. It had consumed all the ambient sound and was now waiting for the only remaining source, Arthur's own body. He held his breath, desperately trying to quiet the frantic thumping of his heart, the gurgling in his stomach, the rush of blood in his ears, all of which were now deafeningly loud against the external void. He knew he couldn't hold it. His chest began to heave. He needed air. And as he finally gasped a ragged breath, the thing stirred. The black shape rippled, and from its center, a hole opened, not of darkness, but of a color Arthur could not name. A blinding, sonic absence. And from that aperture, a whisper came forth. It was so quiet it felt like a thought placed directly into his brain, devoid of air or vibration. Finally, noise. You called it here, Arthur. All that beautiful, perfect silence was a dinner bell. Arthur didn't wait for the rest. He clawed at the 3 latches on the soundproof door, his bloodied fingers scrambling for purchase. He threw the door open and burst out, collapsing on the main staircase. The normal sounds of the house, the groan of the wood, the distant traffic, a painful relief. He never went back down. The workshop remains sealed. But sometimes when the house is still and the digital clock reads 2:44 a.m., he hears a faint woo that cuts through his tinnitus, and he knows that what he locked out of his life, he has now permanently trapped inside his home.